In this video, I'd like to put forward a thought experiment called Choose Your Dictator, a thought experiment on workplace democracy. Imagine a world where all the countries are run as dictatorships. So if you live in a country, you'll be a citizen under a dictator. Some countries, the dictator will treat you well. In other countries, the dictator won't treat you as well. But in every country, the dictator has the ultimate say in how the country's run and what your role in that country is going to be. There's a little addition here, which is somewhat unlike many dictatorships, is that you are actually allowed to leave the country you're a citizen of without question. If you don't like the dictator that you're living under, you can leave that dictatorship to live under to try and live in a country where you think the dictator treats their people far better. However, you're not guaranteed to become a citizen in those other countries. You have to apply for your citizenship, and it's up to the dictator whether you go in or not. If the dictator says no, then you end up being stateless, and if you're stateless, you can seek out some abandoned countries. But these abandoned countries are pretty much deprived of all resources, and everyone who lives there is living in a state of abject poverty. And the only way they can survive is depending on the welfare and charity of the other countries where people are citizens of. So things are pretty tough in the abandoned countries. So the choices you have available to you are to live under a dictatorship that you are under, or you can try your luck and see if you can apply for citizenship in another country where you think things will be better, or you can choose to not live under any dictatorship and to live in the abandoned countries. So the first question I'd like to ask from this thought experiment is, would you consider the situation you are in a democratic one? I think we'd immediately respond that the answer would be no, almost by definition. Regardless of whether a dictator treats you well or treats you badly, has nothing to do with you being in a democratic situation, because you have no say. You've got no choice in how the country is run. And that's a necessary condition of democracy, is that you do have some say, whether it be a very large say or a very small say, whether it's by a direct democracy through a vote on particular situations, or whether it's a representative democracy where you'll vote in particular people who you think will make the decisions better. Where in a situation where you have no say, it's not a democracy. And the fact that you can leave and go somewhere else, that might be better than some other dictatorships, but it's still not a democracy, because the fact that you can leave or stay has nothing to do whether it being a democracy. So I think we can safely say that this situation is not a democracy. The second question I'd like to ask is, would you consider yourself free in this situation? Now, in one respect, whilst being under the dictatorship, we would say, no, we're not free. We've got to do as the dictator tells us to do. Some might object that the fact that we can leave makes us free. So I say, well, you've got some freedom there because you're allowed to leave. And I guess that part could be true. But then you're only free to leave insofar as you go into another situation where you lack the same amount of freedom as in the first situation. Jumping from the freedom to jump from one dictator to the other doesn't seem like the kind of freedom that matters very much. Saying, okay, I'm not free in this situation, but I can leave to go into another situation where I have the same lack of freedom. Doesn't seem to be very compelling. And the fact that you can leave the dictatorships to live in one of the abandoned countries where you're going to be putting yourself into a position of abject poverty, depending on the welfare of others to survive, that's quite a big risk you're taking upon yourself, and quite a harm you impose upon yourself, and that kind of a gamble, that's quite a constraint. So I'd say that's not free either. So I'd be very suspicious on calling this situation a free situation, or a free that has any kind of meaning behind it. Some might object that if you have a good dictator that does allow you a say there's a dictator that will give you, will listen to what you say on how the country's run and take it into proper consideration, and will many times, will even sit down and have an argument with you. Say this is a very enlightened dictator who won't, throw out or kill his citizens because they question him. He likes being questioned and challenged, and he likes listening to what the people say, and will often go in that way if he finds the arguments compelling. So it's like almost like a democracy, in regards that he'll give them almost the same amount of freedom. The issue here can be risen from another thought experiment from a philosopher called Philip Petit, called Nora, where Nora's in a relationship with her husband back in the 1800s in Scandinavia, where at the time women had pretty much no rights. It was all to the husband, like economically and politically and socially, had like the man held all the power in the relationship. But in this situation, Nora's husband gave her all the freedom she could ever want. She can do whatever she wants, whenever she wants. But ultimately, he still had all the say in what goes on. From that thought experiment, he concluded that we couldn't call her free in any real sense, because even though he's allowing all of this freedom, it's still up to him. He could, at any moment, change his mind and take all that freedom away. And that's analogous to this situation, this possible situation of a dictator doing giving lots of freedom to his citizens, is that he could, at a whim, take it all away. So I'd say that still doesn't count as being free in any real sense. So how is this analogous to the workplace? In the workplace, in most workplaces, you will have a business owner, and you must do as the business owner asks of you as one of the workers. You don't have a say. So there's some degree where you might be able to eject due to different workplace laws that we have nowadays. But ignoring those for the moment, although that does have some relevance, is that you don't really have a vote or on what the owner wants you to do at work. You've got to do as the owner says, or you'll be facing the sack very quickly. So this is where this can be analogous, that at a workplace, it's not a place where you have an actual say in how the business is run, or how your role is, or what you're doing in the business. It's ultimately the decision of the owner or your boss. You can leave your job to work for another job, but this is similar to the original thought experiment, where you can only leave one job to try and work at another job. So if you want to work at one job and work at another one, you're in the same relationship as you were in the first place. So, so you have a situation where you have to do as the owner says. You can leave to work somewhere else where you have to do everything that owner says. So this is also analogous to the thought experiment. And to choose to not work at all, to not be in this relationship, has very serious disadvantages. It puts you on depending on welfare, and to live on welfare is not fun at all. I don't think you'll know many people who enjoy living on welfare. It's doing it very, very tough. So you're putting yourself at a serious disadvantage, and depending on what country you live in and what the welfare is like in those countries, is you're putting yourself in giving yourself quite a harm by doing that. So the choices you only have is to work for one owner, where you have to do everything the owner says, or work for another owner, where you have to do what the owner says, or you can not work and put yourself almost to the level of poverty, depending on the country you live in, of course. And the any kind of freedom that the owner might give you, say the owner gives you, listens to you a lot and listens to your complaints, and will allow you to kind of choose the way you do the work or what kind of work you want to do. That's ultimately at the whim of the owner. The owner could decide to become a micromanager at any given moment and demand and impose upon you exactly what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it, and you won't have any say on that when that happens. So it's really a matter of luck on whether the owner is going to give you a lot of freedom in the workplace or not. So these things are all analogous to the thought experiment, and the conclusion we can draw from this is that the relationship between a worker and a business owner is that it's not a democracy. It's more closely analogous to a dictatorship than it is to a democracy. Now, just to be clear here, I'm not trying to commit a hyperbole here. I'm not trying to say an owner is like this, big mean person who's trying to kind of rule over you and so on and so forth. I'm just saying the relationship is not a democratic one. Regarding a possible objection that due to politicians imposing laws upon business owners that will stop them from asking us to do certain tasks or tasks under certain conditions, or union strikes or the threat of union strikes gives employees power to say no to doing certain tasks or under certain conditions. The answer to this objection is to talk about the union strikes first. That's just a form of resistance. That's or a threat of resistance. In non-democratic societies under dictatorships and during monarchies in the past, kings and dictators would very often consider threats of revolt if they wanted to impose upon the people something quite nasty. They would many times refrain from doing that. From the threat of revolt, depending on how serious the threat of the revolt would be and whether the avoiding the revolt would be worse than what they wanted to impose on their citizens. So the claim that we get some freedom due to our ability to threaten a strike doesn't say anything about the relationship being a dictatorship or a democracy. Regarding having laws that stop you from doing some things that are unlawful or unsafe, like work health and safety laws and so on and so forth, is that under a dictatorship, say you had to do everything they had to do, but say there was this overarching law that the dictators themselves had to appeal to, and so you can tell your employee to do whatever you want them to do, but we just got to make sure it's safe and make sure that you're not exploiting them in these particular ways and so on and so forth. It's still not a democracy, because still even that you don't have any say beyond that. So you might have laws restricting some things the dictator does, but at the end of the day, the dictator still has the right to tell you whatever you want to do, and you ultimately have no say in any of how that goes on. So even considering these objections, the relationship is still far more analogous to a dictatorship than it is to a democracy. A Marxist economist who argues the case of the lack of democracy at the workplace in more detail is Professor Richard D. Wolff. In the description below, I'll put a link to his book called Democracy at Work, which goes through this in much more detail. And he is a big champion of worker cooperatives, which is businesses, but what they are is run and owned collectively by all the people who work there. There's not one owner. Each person who works there holds a equal kind of share, or at least a comparative share in the business. So they all also have a legitimate vote in how the business is run and what they do and what's done with the profits and so on and so forth. So he sees worker cooperatives as a useful way to resolve the issue of lack of democracy in the workplace. If you want more videos, you can go onto my website, philosophycriticalthinking.com. On that website, there's a tutorial on arguments from analogy and thought experiments, which can be useful in analyzing thought experiments and arguments from analogy like this one today. I'll also have in the description a Amazon link to the book Democracy at Work by Richard D. Wolff, and also an Introduction to Philosophical Methods by Chris Daly. If you'd like to stick around for more videos, please subscribe and click the bell. Thanks.